Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. Now, in an attempt to buff up my ego, I asked recently, what is the defining thing about the host of this podcast? And thank you so much for this listener who sent in this clip.
Nobody can remember his name.
Lovely.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always. That's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, it's given away in the title, really. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about production stories, marketing stories, release stories, distribution stories, all the ingredients that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast, they lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation. It's really, really hard to make a movie. We're going back to 1982, and I'm going to play you a clip from the trailer for a Martin Scorcese classic.
And what I'm thinking as I'm sitting here now, well, maybe this is my big break. This is my big chance. You know what I mean?
You don't just walk onto a network show without experience. Now, I know it's an old hackneyed expression, but it happens to be the truth. You've got to start at the bottom.
I know, that's where I am, at the bottom.
That's a perfect place to start.
So will you please give your warmest greetings to the newest king of comedy, Rupert Pupkin.
His name is Rupert Pupkin. He lives in a world of make-believe.
Oh, Jerry, I love this guy. Always coming up with these great lines. I love him.
Nobody can remember his name.
Mr. Pipkin. Mr. Pupnik.
Mr. Puffer.
Rupert.
Pupkin, P-U-P-K-I-N.
But by 11:30 tonight, the whole world will know that Rupert Pupkin is the new king of comedy. Robert De Niro, Jerry Lewis, in a Martin Scorcese picture. The king of comedy.
Well, so I'm going to play you a clip from the trailer. In the end, I decided to play you the full trailer for the 1982 movie, The King of Comedy, directed by Martin Scorcese, written by Paul D. Zimmerman, and starring Robert De Niro, Jerry Lewis, and Sandra Bernhard in the three lead roles in the film. Now, this is, over time, has become a much, much loved Martin Scorsese movie. He's overlooked classic to a degree, but at the point of its release, well, as we're about to find out, it kind of fell hard, really. So I'm going to start with Sean Levy's biography of Robert De Niro, which I talked about a bit on this podcast in previous episodes. Very, very worth digging out. And Levy uncovered that it was back in 1974 that Robert De Niro took delivery of a manuscript. That manuscript was of the unpublished novel, wouldn't you know it, The King of Comedy. It had been written by Paul Zimmerman. And Zimmerman had been a film critic at Newsweek, and he'd taken influence in his story from the talk show of the era that was hosted by a man called David Susskind. Now, in particular, he was watching an episode of Susskind's show where autograph hunters came on and were spoken to, were part of the programme. And what he said was, I was struck by the personal way these autograph hunters related to the stars. And so one of them said, Barbara is hard to work with, and was on about Barbara Streisand. As it turned out, Barbara Streisand had asked this particular autograph hunter not to bother her, but, quote, he turned that into it, Barbara is hard to work with, just because she'd asked for a bit of space. And also Zimmerman said there was another fellow who had kept a daily diary of his impressions of the Johnny Carson show. Now, here in the UK, the Johnny Carson show, not as big a thing. I'm very conscious that in the US, one of the premier and most famous talk shows in US television history. And so what happened is Zimmerman saw these two slightly different stories, the kind of celebrity stalker, really, and married them together to make story, The King of Comedy. In particular, he used these to mould a character. This would be the character of Rupert Pupkin, a man described as a little bit of a groupie, but also a stand-up comedian. The problem for Zimmerman, though, once he'd fashioned his story and found this character, was he just couldn't get the book published. And after a few attempts to do so, he decided to take a different path and turned it into a screenplay instead. And so that screenplay was the one that came into the possession of Robert De Niro. And I found a couple of conflicting reports about just who gave who the screenplay. That one report says the screenplay got to Martin Scorsese first in the early 1970s, and it's he who passed it to De Niro. I've seen it also written the other way round. I'm not on speed dial with either of them, so I can't 100% ascertain. The crucial part is both of them were aware of this script in around 1974, but also after their success on Mean Streets, they were about to get working together on a film called, what was this one? Taxi Driver. Wonder what happened to that. Now, the New York Times noted that Scorsese in 1976 actually rejected The King of Comedy, the problem being it was, quote, too simple and too superficial in the guise that he'd seen it. Now, this meant that the project moved on, and in fact, another filmmaker and another screenwriter got involved, actually, because even though the book still hadn't been published, a writer by the name of Buck Henry picked it up and came up with a fresh screenplay based on the manuscript that Zimmerman had put together. He did so with this as a possible project for director Milos Forman, who was riding incredibly high off the back of the all-time classic One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Now, the script that Buck Henry wrote, that was also sent to Robert De Niro, who had retained interest in the project, but he wasn't as interested in Buck Henry's take on the material. And in fact, when he took delivery of that, he asked instead if he could take the original script back to Martin Scorsese again, and thus Buck Henry and Milos Forman would no longer be involved. And as it turned out, that's pretty much what he did. The thing was, though, that if De Niro's head was very much in the material, and it really was, he really saw something in the character of Rupert Pupkin that he wanted to explore, Martin Scorsese couldn't really see what was in it for him at that stage. He didn't have the same eureka moment with it. And in fact, he was looking at pursuing a different project for the pair to work on, a film called Nightlight, which would have told the story of a pair of brothers. One of the brothers would have been a cop, the other a comedian, and he wanted to lure Robert De Niro to that. However, De Niro still leant towards The King of Comedy, and De Niro's star was the one very, very much on the rise. The Godfather Part 2 had won him an Oscar. He was about to get another Oscar as well, and that would come in the form of Scorsese and De Niro's next collaboration at this point, 1980's Raging Bull. Raging Bull was to be their fourth film together. That Mean Streets had hit in 73, Taxi Driver in 76, they'd done New York in 77. But rather than pressing ahead with King of Comedy, it was Raging Bull that was next on the list of films that they were going to tackle. And Raging Bull is, bluntly, an absolute masterpiece. I say this as someone who only watched it in the last few years. Shame, shame, shame on me. It's one of those things, though, when someone... I haven't resisted the film, it's just a case of opportunity. But I'm also very conscious that when people tell you a film is brilliant, that almost the reputation of it sometimes puts you off. You just feel like you don't want it. You don't want it to let you down. Raging Bull does not let you down. It is fabulous. Directed by Scorsese, starring Robert De Niro, it's a stunning piece of cinema, and over time its reputation has rightly only enhanced. I mean, it did have success on its 1980 release as well. Robert De Niro picked up another Oscar for his stunning portrayal of the boxer Jake LaMotta. But also, by the time Scorsese had made Raging Bull, by the time he'd come through that, he was pretty much had enough of narrative fiction feature films. And in fact, he was looking more towards documentary. He needed to recharge his batteries a little bit. He was living a hell of a life at that point. You can dig into Scorsese's history to find out a little bit more about that. And whilst ahead of the premiere of Raging Bull, he'd verbally said to De Niro, all right, I'll do King of Comedy. I'm not sure he did it in that accent. After coming through the release period of Raging Bull, he just wasn't that keen. He just saw it as a De Niro project. I mean, De Niro continuing to show interest and pursue it. I mean, he was talking to autograph hunters and getting their stories, but it just wasn't quite sure what the hook was for Scorsese. However, the bond between De Niro and Scorsese meant this was worth a punt. And so what happened is they went to New York and they met up with Paul Zimmerman. And they sat around with the 2 screenplays they had for The King of Comedy. The aim then was to work through those 2 scripts to find a film that they could both lock into. And I mean, Zimmerman said at this point he was quite uncertain about what might come out the other end. And De Niro and Scorsese were also doing work on it as well. And as Sean Levy says in his book, De Niro Alive, he just said, I literally jumped up and down. They had synthesized the script and the book. And whilst De Niro and Scorsese would not take credit for this, the credit for the script would go to Zimmerman, they did have a handprint on it and in homing it into what ultimately the story became. Now, what that called for in the end, the screenplay that they were all excited about, was a film with 3 lead roles. You have Masha, the female lead, and you had the talk show host, Jerry Langford. Now, Jerry Langford is a kind of a cipher, really, of Johnny Carson. I mean, he was, again, an inevitable inspiration, but also one of the original inspirations for Zimmerman was a talk show host by the name of Dick Cavett as well. And so when it came to casting, actually, they did approach Johnny Carson, but what he didn't fancy was the jump from TV to film, because when he was doing his talk show, he delivered it to camera, that was it. Pack up, get in your car, off you go home. The idea of doing it for film with all the endless retakes and just the sheer amount of time it would take, it just didn't appeal to him. And so he turned down the opportunity to take on one of the 3 lead roles, although he would stay involved in the production. Now, interestingly as well, an inquiry went out to Frank Sinatra about whether he'd be interested in being the talk show host. Sinatra was winding his film career down a little bit by this stage, but he looked at it and then eventually rejected the movie. That Orson Welles was a name that was floated at one point, but was Orson Welles famous enough, bizarrely, just as a front of camera performer? He would be voicing the Transformers animated movie a few years later, and let us not have a word said against that film. Then they looked around the rest of the Rat Pack. That Dean Martin was in there, Sammy Davis Jr., and it was the Dean Martin link that got them to a man called Jerry Lewis. That Lewis had worked with Dean Martin and was now in a fallow period of his career. That he hadn't made a film for many, many years come 1980. He'd had well-reported personal problems. Let's just say he was a man that was said to be on the grumpy side as well. And a fun collaborator, he just didn't look like one. However, Scorsese kind of warmed to that, really. I mean, that fitted the character, didn't he? And so Scorsese met up with Jerry Lewis and they had conversations about it. And Scorsese just increasingly warmed to the idea of casting him. But Scorsese didn't have the final call, really, that De Niro needed to sign off on the casting, and 2 Oscars on his mantelpiece by this point. He was going to take his time. That De Niro had pursued and was interested in this project for a long time. He was not going to rush to give a yes to the idea of one of his co-stars. And in fact, even though Scorsese warmed to Jerry Lewis quickly, it took 5 meetings over a period of 6 months for Robert De Niro to basically sign off on the casting as well. Even then, he was still pushing for Johnny Carson, but in the end, he gave the green light to Jerry Lewis, but also said to him, I need you to know that I really want to kill you on this picture. And De Niro's very method at this point. He said, we can't socialise, we can't have dinner, we can't go out. And Jerry Lewis was quoted again in Sean Levy's book as saying to De Niro, whatever turns you on, sweetheart, and are there any ground rules about saying good morning? I mean, he can't say he didn't know what he was walking into. De Niro was in the period of his career where his work and his performances were intense, based on an enormous amount of research. It would only lighten as it got later in his career that every single role wouldn't get quite that level of emphasis. This one was going to. Now, Lewis would come in and do some sharpening of the dialogue. In fact, Scorsese, Zimmerman and Lewis would sit down and work out just what kind of stuff Jerry Langford was going to say. The character of Masha was very, very tricky to cast. Now, Kathy Moriarty had won a supporting Oscar for her work in Raging Bull. That particularly around this time, you wouldn't necessarily say Martin Scorsese films were great for female roles, but when they did have one in, acclaim was going to follow. And the fact that if you starred in a Scorsese film, it upped your chances of getting some Oscar attention. Well, let's just say there were a lot of people keen, at the very least, to explore the idea of co-starring in The King of Comedy. Meryl Streep was suggested. I mean, she'd appeared in The Deer Hunter with Robert De Niro by this point, but she said to have turned the role down. Others who were around, Ellen Barkin was one of those mentioned. Deborah Winger was one of those mentioned. But the casting director on The King of Comedy was Sis Corman, and it was she who suggested the really left field choice of Sandra Bernhard. Not a name known for film work, certainly was a reputation in comedy, if anything. Bernhard came in and auditioned for Martin Scorcese and Robert De Niro, and then after the audition they went to see her live performance at the Comedy Store. They were taken with her. They thought, again, there's something here, and so then she had to be flown to New York to meet with Jerry Lewis, and that's the bit where she said she was really, really nervous because she was aware of his reputation, she was aware of his extensive previous work, but the fact that she was nervous in his presence, well, that really worked again for the character, and she got the job. The plan then was for filming to get underway in the summer of 1981, but there were two factors that were coming into play here. The first of which was Martin Scorsese's health, that he wasn't in a good position in his life at this point. He was coughing, he was spluttering. Again, dig into his personal back history, you can kind of see what he was going through at this stage in his career. And so Scorsese was keen to push the movie back towards the end of 1981, certainly wasn't ready to do it in the summer. However, the other factor here was that the Directors Guild of America was on the verge of going on strike. Now, this meant that a lot of productions were going to shut down, and in fact, the criteria for in 1981 was if a certain amount of your film wasn't shot by the time the strike actually got underway, then your film would be shut down. So this was going to be the first picture for the company Embassy Pictures, and there was a keenness to get this before the cameras, not in the summer of 81 as had originally been planned, but to move it forward a month so that they could just take advantage of this small window and get the film shot that year. Scorsese's health not great at all, but he had little choice if they were going to do the film of hitting a 1st of June 1981 start date, which is what happened. Now, the New York Times did a report on the film in August of 1981, and it reported that the film was shooting at Reeves Sound Studio in New York City and was also shooting on location in and around the New York area. But throughout the shoot of the movie, Scorsese just was not a well man. There was a lot of coughing and spluttering and a real sense that he was battling through to get the film made. But also, it was an intense movie to make. That, for instance, Robert De Niro wanted a lot of retakes and reshoots. He wanted to hone this performance. He wanted to get it right. And so on the one hand, you had De Niro, who would take all the takes he needed just to put in the performance that he wanted. On the flip side of that, there's Jerry Lewis, who had starred in Hollywood productions of old, where you got a couple of goes, that was your lot, you've got to move on. So Lewis was struggling to adapt to De Niro's way of working, that he was used to being on sets where things moved a lot faster, and now here he was with De Niro using 20, 30 takes, a director who wasn't very well, and just a degree of underlying tension to it. It wasn't as if De Niro was in the downtime coming up to him and they're having a chat about the football or anything like that. But Lewis knew what he was signing up for before, and he knew too that the chances are this was going to be special. I mean, he wasn't daft. He'd seen Raging Bull, and he figured if this was the process of De Niro and Scorsese, if this what they needed to do to end up with that kind of end result, then, yep, I will do whatever I have to do in order to fit in. His philosophy to it was relatively straightforward. He's going to keep quiet. He's not going to cause trouble. He's going to button his lip. He will do his work. He will put up with whatever he has to put up with. Now, he would admit, again to Sean Levy, that De Niro and Scorsese have, quote, eccentricities that I as a filmmaker had to adjust to because I wasn't there as a filmmaker. He said if they'd hired me as part of the filmmaking team, I'd have killed them both because it was against everything I was taught. And he said, for example, I do my homework. When I come on the set, I can tell you every shot that will be made on that picture that day, right up to wrap. Scorsese, he argued, comes onto the set, and the first thing he does is check the temperature of Robert De Niro before he lays out what the day's work is going to be and what he's going to do. And again, Lewis reconciled, I know that this is the best way to get a performance out of Robert De Niro, but for the rest of us around it, the rest of the film crew, the rest of the cast, it's really quite hard to do. And they identified that the hardest scene to shoot, I'm going very, very spoiler light if you've not seen The King of Comedy, was one where the character Rupert Pupkin turns up at the house of Lang Langford. And this one particular scene took 2 weeks to do. It also took De Niro needling Lewis to get the response and the explosion and the reaction we see on screen. And so afterwards, I mean, there was some quite offensive and unpleasant stuff said just to get under the skin of Lewis. And as he said, afterwards, De Niro in the end was said to have just come into the dressing room and said, "Are you okay?" And Lewis said to him, "Yes, I'm fine. I never want to work with you again." De Niro had done extensive research to get to this point. He'd watched hour after hours after hours of late night talk shows. He'd interviewed stand-up comedians, he'd interviewed talk show hosts, he'd interviewed autograph hunters, he'd looked at old joke books. He just had to get his head into the mindset of Rupert Pupkin. He based his speech pattern on Paul Zimmerman, as it turns out, and it took a while for him just to capture his particular take on the role. It's quite interesting. If you fast forward to the Joker movie that came out a few years ago at the point of recording, with Todd Phillips directed that film, Joaquin Phoenix and Robert De Niro in it, you see almost the reverse of the character that he was putting on screen there. And there is a very clear through line, however faint, between the King of Comedy and Joker and what De Niro was up to. Now, Sandra Bernhard, meanwhile, she was having a blast, really, working with De Niro and Scorsese. She was putting it. I still think her performance in this film is outstanding, really unsettling and outstanding in a film that has a lot of unsettling and outstanding performances in it. Tom Schon's book, Martin Scorcese, a retrospective, talks about this as well. Also talks about the detail about how Scorsese, when they were shooting the film, had Robert De Niro call Jerry Langford, the character Jerry Langford, from the same phone that Scorsese had been using to pester producers in the early 70s. Filming wrapped up. I mean, it beat the strike. It got what was required. The filming was wrapped up in the early autumn of 1981, and that would point towards a release in 1982. That's a fairly straightforward decision. You'd think that they'd get the film out and sit back and wait for the acclaim and hopefully get a few more Oscars as well. But the edit was, I mean, Scorsese went through the edit with his regular editor, Thelma Schumacher, and they came up with a film that was just shy of 2 hours long. And it was ready to go in front of the studio. It was ready to go in front of test audiences as well. But the film didn't actually appear. It just seemed to be taking an awful lot more time than people were expecting to see it, bluntly. Because the story here now moves forward to September of 1982. So that's a year or so after the film had wrapped. And that's when Variety reported that 20th Century Fox had announced that the film's release date was at that stage pushed back to quote an unspecified date. It had been expected that The King of Comedy would be in cinemas for the end of 1982, but it was delayed with no new date allowed. Now, as 20th Century Fox reps told Variety at that point, it was the delayed opening will, quote, allow the studio to better market its soundtrack. Okay. But the editing that had taken place had, well, let's just say the cut that Scorsese presented to Fox in the end was one that Fox didn't have the slightest clue what to do with, because Fox was distributing the movie in the US at least. And I mean, it just took delivery of it. It watched the film and there were no stars really. Well, it's not a case that there are no stars, but there were star names that were doing things that they weren't stars for. So if you're trying to sell a Robert De Niro film, sell him in a mob movie or something like that. But do you sell him as a kind of stalkerish stand-up comedian who's really creepy and not very pleasant? Well, that's a lot trickier, isn't it? It didn't help too that Fox tried test audiences as well, and the test audiences just didn't like the film at all. In fact, the word was that some of the test audiences flat out hated The King of Comedy, and so Fox just decided to cut its losses. Never mind that it had a Scorsese movie, it just buried it. And it moved the release in the US to February of 1983. Just, 18 months, nearly 2 years after filming had begun. So the US release came first. In fact, no, I tell a lie. It apparently came out in Iceland at the end of 1982. But when it came out in the US, I mean, the critical response to it was, some people really liked it. But it would be fair to say this absolutely split the crowd. Some hated it. Some really liked it. A lot of people just didn't know what to make of it. Scorsese and De Niro had never delivered a film like this, and when they came up with something incredibly unusual, certainly for the pair of them as well, what do you do with it? And I've heard this from filmmakers a few times, that they've gone off and they've made something that people weren't expecting, and they feel they've taken a battering for it just because the preconception didn't marry up to what you ultimately got. I think there might be a bit of that with The King of Comedy. The film that was presented to audiences and to critics, though, I mean, there's no two ways about it, just didn't find its place in 1983. I mean, incredibly ahead of its time in many ways. I mean, I took the liberty of just looking up the box office chart to see if that was barely worth doing, really. And the film cost $19 million to make, but on its opening weekend, I mean, it was buried February the 18th to the 21st, that weekend in 1983. Not a point where films of a particular profile were being released. It had missed the Oscar run, and it was in a fallow period for the box office. It wasn't in the Valentine's market, was it? It opened in 16th place, and the films that were at the top were the likes of Tootsie, Gandhi, The Sting 2, Lovesick, The Lords of Discipline, that sounds kinky, 48 Hours, Sophie's Choice, E.T. You have to go a long way down the chart to find The King of Comedy. But then, I mean, as it just added a few more screens to its run, I mean, it made not the slightest bit of difference at all, and it just dropped out of the chart. In fact, if you just followed the charts for the weeks afterwards, it's just not even listed. The box office return on The King of Comedy was $2.5 million. That was your lot for a $19 million film from a brand new film financier, film production company. It was regarded as a flop. No two ways about it. Now, there was an attempt really to approach the release outside of the US slightly differently. Because, I mean, I'm digging into an article here from the New York Times from May of 1983, and it reports that the 36th Cannes International Film Festival opened with, what do you know about it? The King of Comedy. And that was, as it described, because of the, quote, long-running love affair between France and Jerry Lewis. So never mind the fact the film had cratered, really, in the US. It was Jerry Lewis who dominated, I'm quoting the article, the opening night Saturday, receiving ovations from the crowd gathered in front of the film centre on the Cannes waterfront when he entered and left. Mr. Lewis also dominated the scene inside from his front row seat, and the response to him and the film at Cannes was just slightly more pleasant than it had been in the US. Now, this, in theory, is the story then of a box office failure that disappears into the ether, only it just didn't happen. I mean, but by the end of 1983, the film was not being spoken about nicely. That in Tom Shon's book, there's this quote, just this passage that says, at dinner with his friend Jay Cox at the end of 1983, Scorsese heard someone on TV refer to the movie as, quote, the flop of the year, and figured it was an end of an era for his kind of filmmaking. And I really, by the sounds of it, took it really quite hard. Scorsese would go, I mean, his dream project at that point was The Last Temptation of Christ, that he wanted to make with Robert De Niro, that De Niro wasn't particularly keen on. It would be 3 years before he released another film. That wouldn't go particularly great either. It'd be 1985's After Hours before finally getting a hit on his card. In 1986 is The Colour of Money, which I've covered before on this podcast. What's interesting about The King of Comedy, though, is how its reputation grew. And I first saw it in a cinema here in Birmingham in the UK in the early 1990s. And it was really weird that the cinema even put that on, because it was a big multiplex and it was just having a season of films from the 80s. I can't even remember what the umbrella for it was. And it put The King of Comedy on, so I went along and watched it. I was just like, oh crikey, this is great. And lots of people since have decided that The King of Comedy is great. And particularly now, when you look at the films that are covering similar ground to the one that this movie got to a long time ago, and I know one or two people who really don't care for the picture at all. I really do. There is a real argument that this is top 5 Scorsese stuff, top 5 De Niro stuff as well, and also Sandra Bernhardt's performance, really special. There was, I mean, the legacy of it has just grown, and I think Scorsese's recognised that as well. He in the immediate aftermath of the film, he and De Niro decided to take a break from each other. In fact, they wouldn't come back together until Goodfellas at the end of the decade. They went off in their own different ways and built successes in different directions as well. But also there was continued interest as time went on in revisiting the film in different ways. That there was an idea at one stage that Jack Black was going to do a remake of it, but I don't really think there was there much in the way of legs to that. Lots of people talk about it as lots of respected film people talk about it as well, about what it's one of their favourite films or a key influence for them. And then it almost got to the stage in Broadway that in 2015 Stephen Trask was writing the music and lyrics from a book by Chris Arancio for a Broadway musical of The King of Comedy, which I know did some testing at the very least. I couldn't find evidence in the end that it ultimately happened, but Broadway musicals are not my forte. I suppose the biggest commercial indictment of The King of Comedy is just how closely the $1 billion grossing Joker film, which I will come to at some point in this podcast, leans on it and almost sees it to a degree as a bit of a template for the film that Todd Phillips put out. But you look in the back catalogue of Scorsese movies, and it does stand out as kind of the underseen gem, even though its reputation has grown a lot in recent times. No sequel to it, no great big huge 4K release of it or anything like that, and it perhaps isn't as overtly revered as many of Scorsese's movies, but crikey, if you're looking to dig into his back catalogue and find something just a little bit special, this one really is it. As always, thank you so much for listening and thank you for your time. I'm going to do my parish notices at this point. First and foremost, if you like this podcast, don't mind supporting it. There are a few ways you can do so other than lending it your ears. Thank you so much for lending it your ears. If you go to patreon.com/SimonBrew and put a few coins in the pot there, then you get the podcast early. You get it ad-free as well. You find out what we're up to behind the scenes too. Thank you to all the people who support me there. I can't tell you how appreciated it is. Likewise, to the people who've been reviewing this podcast at their podcast home of choice. That costs you nothing, and I've just had an influx of positive reviews after not much for a long time. Again, thank you so much for the people who've taken the time to leave ideally 5-star reviews for independent podcasts. I can't tell you how much difference that makes. And then the other way is just subscribe. Click the subscribe button at your podcast home of choice. Again, costs you absolutely nothing, but boy does it help us with algorithms and things that I don't understand. I have magazines for sale as well. Print magazines, print film magazines, just like they used to make and still sometimes make. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, you can find them there. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening and thank you for your time. If I've not completely bored you, you get more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew, on Blue Sky at Simon Brew. Film Stories is on Twitter at Film Stories. We're at facebook.com/Film Stories online, youtube.com/Film Stories. The Patreon is patreon.com/Simon Brew. The shop is store.filmstories.co.uk. We've got a few Blu-rays left of No Way Out and Bull Durham, the UK Blu-ray premieres of both of those films. We're still shipping those out. All of our print magazines are there as well. And then if you go to filmstories.co.uk, that's our website. It's got movie news, game news, television news, reviews, features, mischief, mayhem. The website broke this week because it had too much traffic on it, but you didn't need to know that. We think we've fixed it now, and we've got a whole collection of people who are running around wheels to try and generate the energy to keep the servers going. Thank you to everyone who's paid us a visit. Most important thing, as always, though, is that you're all well, that you all take care, and I will return soon with some more film stories. I've got a couple of specials coming your way as well, so please look out for that. Take care, look after yourselves. I'll speak to you again soon. Bye bye.